Good morning to everybody, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Gin Guild members. I have been here 4 years now, Gymposium events, and I have always been overwhelmed by the outpouring of knowledge, passion, and literal pouring of gin. I can assure you that it's much easier being in the seats down there than it is being up here. This is frankly terrifying. So thank you, Nicholas, for scaring the hell out of me. My name is Ben Marston, and I am co-founder, distiller, director, dog's body, everything at Puddingstone Distillery, the home of Campfire Gin. We are Hertfordshire's first distillery. We opened in November 2016, and when I say we, it is a husband and wife team. We have picked up in our last 2.5 years 5 International Spirits Awards. We were the winners of the World's Best Martini Challenge at the start of the year, and our focus has been on producing gins that are effectively heritage styles. What is not included in that lineup there is an Old Tom, which complements the London Dry cask and Navy strength. We set up and established ourselves as a micro distillery. However, Bill Owens, founder of the ADI, published an article, I think last year, in which we referred to as nano, so smaller. I see that as a positive, room for growth. The journey from a kitchen distiller, or indeed somebody with no knowledge really of the product at all, to where we are now, has been an interesting one, to say the least. And there are a number of hurdles for anybody getting into the gin industry. There are a lot of knowns, there are a lot of unknowns. The knowns are going to be things like HMRC, planning, licensing, dealing with banks, finding staff, dealing with leases, property, and safety elements. There are also unknowns, and this is what I am going to talk about today, hence the title, Growing Pains. We started this journey back in 2014, in January, in a hospital in North London. Things could really only get better. I was in there for a very minor wrist operation, and we discovered that it was going to be delayed for 6 hours. That meant, for me, 6 hours walking around in one of those rather voluminous, unflattering, and breezy post-op gowns. My wife decided to go and find something else to do to kill the time, and that was to purchase a couple of books. Now, I've regaled this story, and I have in my notes here the word Waterstones, because I often tell people she went to Wetherspoons. That would have been a completely different outcome. We would have not been involved in the gin industry. We would have been selling cheap beer and funny carpets. So off she went to Waterstones and purchased 2 books. One of them was The Flavour Thesaurus by Nicky Segnit, the other Simon Difford's Guide to Gin. Combined with our passion for the product and past involvement in trying to drive food tourism in Hertfordshire, which is where we're based, we decided that the region needed a gin distillery, and we set up Hertfordshire's first gin distillery. Being first has with it pros and cons. Now, like many startup distilleries, we started the process at home. And that, for us, meant that we wanted to do it properly. So we applied to HMRC for a license so that we could start buying in pure alcohol, because we wanted to experiment with things like different charge ratios. It's common sometimes for startups to just use vodka and infuse botanicals in that to get an idea of where they're going, but we wanted to experiment a bit more. And so we were granted a license, which allowed us to buy in 5 litres of NGS. And that struck me as somewhat unusual, because actually we were bringing in a highly flammable substance into a domestic property, indeed a kitchen, that was devoid of any ATEX regulation, any safety features. There was no fire blanket, there was no fire extinguishers. it's a potentially very dangerous thing to be doing. Fortunately, this doesn't refer to the Big Bang that is in our, the title of this presentation. It does, though, raise a question about how brands develop and the environment in which they do, and potential safety concerns, because we've seen not only this year but past years where there have been instances not only in residential environments but also in full-scale distilleries. Along with the alcohol, we managed to purchase a couple of test stills, some small copper alembics, which at the time, strangely, the billing invoice described them as decorative metal objects. I'm not quite sure whether that was a customs dodge of something. So basically, we started development work, and the key thing for us was to always look at where we were going to go. We wanted to scale up to a property, an environment that would allow us to be more commercially viable. Now, that involved obviously obtaining licenses, starting to look at properties, and effectively getting on the radar of all of the organisations that can either help or hinder your progress as a distillery. The process was relatively straightforward until we were approached by different organisations with a number of questions. The two most common ones were, are you going to blind people? And are you going to blow up Tring, the area where we were distilling? Now, we had a business plan. It wasn't the most honed of business plans, but maiming and killing people wasn't in the bullet points. We discovered very quickly that being the first distillery in an area meant that the authorities around you weren't aware of what they needed to be doing to ensure a free path to gin nirvana. So we had to kind of educate people outside us who were ultimately going to allow us to move forward. Blinding people. We all know the impact of methanol. We had to explain to various authorities that methanol was not going to be introduced into our system. It wasn't going to be in our building, and that the horrific cases back in 2013, 2014 in Libya, in Africa, where literally hundreds of people were being poisoned through methanol being introduced into product, wasn't going to happen with our distillery. As far as blowing up Tring, the town that we're based, I kind of like it. There's bits that could be flattened, but again, not in our plan. However, what had happened was the authorities had lumped us in with other big distilleries. So you can be a tiny little setup like us. You can be a very, very large scale distillery. You can be an industrial refinery. We got lumped in with chemical production facilities, oil refineries, oil storage facilities, all kinds of things. We were categorized as being one of them, and therefore we were the same risk as all of those other sites. Now, if anybody knows geographically where we are, we're in Hertfordshire, not too far from a place called Hemel Hempstead. And Hemel Hempstead is the home to Buncefield. If you may recall, back in 2005, Buncefield Oil Refinery blew up. It caused the largest peacetime explosion in the whole of Europe. It was heard in Belgium. We lived about 9 miles away. It dislodged our roof hatch with the shockwave. This apparently is potentially what we could do if we had an explosion. We had to re-educate. To be quite honest, if our little place blew up, it would probably scatter the geese that are on the nearby reservoir, but nothing much more than that. So what did we do? Well, myself and my wife, Kate, we're creatives. That's our background. I've worked in the brewing industry for 10 years, but we didn't have the scientific knowledge that somebody like Anne does, for example. We weren't pharmacists, we weren't chemists, we weren't engineers. So we had to acquire that information. And how do you do that? Well, you attend events like these. You go to the London Distilling Expo. you sit exams, and that's what we did. We studied at the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, sat various exams, so that we could go back to all of these people with new knowledge and actually kind of introduce a degree of confidence, wave some paper and some certificates at these people and say, actually, we do know what we're doing. And that allowed us to move forward, or so we thought. We did a lot of searching for property. In a rural environment, property is quite difficult to come by. Certainly property that's got a roof or has got parking or power, the critical things that you need when you're setting up a distillery. We eventually met up with a local farmer who agreed to build a unit. We had an idea for a project which was effectively a food producer's hub. So lots and lots of different producers coming together under one roof. Myself and Kate helped drive the build of that project forward. We agreed to lease terms and we got in other tenants. But before we could do any of that, we again had to fight a battle. The site was ready to be built upon, it had all been cleared, and then somebody got in the way. And that somebody was Richard III. You can't write this stuff. Richard III, as you may recall, he's dead, by the way, very much so, found in 2012 underneath a car park in Leicester. And we had some friends in different planning departments around the UK who informed us that this scenario had caused a little bit of panic nationwide. Basically, if there were going to be any new developments, and they were near sites of special scientific interest, historical enclaves, sites where there had been previous archaeological finds, all manner of things, listed buildings, that full archaeological surveys needed to be carried out on those sites. Now, this is fine. I have no problem in people rediscovering history. There were two issues, though, however. One was the local council didn't have anybody to carry this out, and it took 3 months for them to do so. The second was that 15 years previous, the site that we were going to occupy was actually a car park, and an archaeological survey had been carried out there. It was unlikely in those 15 years that somebody would have shoehorned in an old monarch just to upset somebody else further down the line. So, they did the excavation. There was nothing to be found, which is a shame, because if they had, we would have changed our wooden floor to glass. We'd have made sure that said dead monarch was staring up with a Martini glass in hand. Quite ironically, since that happened, there have been 2 gins that have come to the market, both Dead King gins, one from the Boutique Gin Company and one from Burley's. So, we managed to get this part of the process out of the way. And then another problem, which links very much back to what Anne was saying about stills, configurations, design, and materials. We had been doing all of our development work on a very tiny copper still with a worm tub condenser and distilling off no more than about, well, our charge was 0.4 of a litre. When we moved into our distillery and set up our various stills, the smallest one we were working on initially was a 50-litre still with a 40-litre charge. We were basically looking at a multiplier of 100. Now, I spoke to some distillers, and they said, well, it depends on your botanicals, it depends on this, that, and the other, but the thing is just to try it, first of all. Scale it up proportionally, see what happens. As some of you here know, we created singularly the most disgusting liquid that has ever graced the face of this planet. It was genuinely foul, and it took numerous attempts to actually get it back to where we wanted it to be. On the flip side, we actually got it better than where it had been with our original developments. But hindsight, I think it's better to start working with the materials you're going to use on your production basis. As Anne was saying, and as you've experienced from those samples, there is a big difference on materials, but there is a huge difference on still configuration. And I think that was probably the biggest factor in the whole process, the actual shape of the still. So we got scaling up, out of the way, and it forced us to do something else as well, which I would advise any new distiller to look at. We had always been looking at a single shot process, but if you want to grow efficiently, then you really do need to consider multi-shotting as well. And that transition from having a nice product in a small still to something that was frankly disgusting in a larger scale still forced us to reevaluate and work out how we could be more efficient. So the development process from that stage was not only one of actually getting a decent gin again, but also how could we make a lot more and a lot more efficiently. So why did we put ourselves through all of this pain? Why did we not just contract out to somebody else? The simple answer is that we wanted to make it. We wanted to have a level of engagement with our customer base that was genuine. We wanted to have a site where we could draw people in, show them the stills, show them where we make the stuff, where we label, where we bottle, have a story to tell. I've looked at some of the presentations coming a bit later on, and I'm sorry for this, Tom, but you mentioned graft gin. And I think it's a very, very important thing to pick up on. In the absence of a general consensus as to what craft is, I think we need to look at graft as an option or an alternative. That is all the work that goes in to producing something, all the blood, the sweat, the tears, to produce a gin that you can genuinely take ownership of, that is yours from your raw ingredients through to the final product. And that may almost kill you as a small startup distiller, growing and growing and growing, but it's well worth the effort. Thank you very much.